Joining us to break all of this down is Ratnadeep Chakraborty. He's an Indian journalist specializing in terrorism, and international affairs analyst Dan Perry, the former Europe and Middle East editor at the Associated Press. The relationship between Netanyahu and Modi is particularly close. You see that in the images of them embracing when Modi gets off of the plane. But obviously, we can't forget those images of the two, their toes in the sand and the water at Olga Beach. I'm interested to get your perspective as to how much you think Netanyahu trusts India as a potential mediator with the conflict between Iran and the United States. Like Ratnadeep was saying, India does seem to be trying to present itself as a potential mediator down the line.
India historically has been a leader, maybe the leader, of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. And it seems at this point they want to be aligned with everyone, with the possible exception of China. And a country in that position obviously could potentially be a mediator. And it's not just any country. It's the world's most popular country, the world's most populous country, the world's most populous democracy, number 3 economy in the world, a very significant player, one that has tremendous growth as well in its future. So the per capita income will rise. I think he does, to a degree, trust Modi more than others for a lot of reasons. But on the other hand, I don't think he's looking for any mediation with Iran. It is extremely useful for Netanyahu to be able to show that a country as important as India has a leader who is openly aligned with and perhaps even allied with his variant of Israel, because he's very isolated in the world. And if it wasn't for Donald Trump, it would be pretty close to a situation where no major democracy has positive karma towards Israel. And here is the world's largest democracy being truly friendly. Israel has a lot to gain. We spoke of the $8.7 billion worth of deals that are being signed. Israel and India have a lot of downstream potential. Bilateral trade in goods and services is only something like $6 billion. That's about 2% of Israel's trade.
Right.
And India obviously is a quarter of the world's population almost. So Israel could do better, wants to do better. And there is symbiosis between Israel and India. Israel has a capability high-tech economy. India has a monumental scale economy.
Right.
And there's a lot that they can do for each other, on top of which I think Netanyahu has some considerable simpatico towards Modi and vice versa, because both are seen as, to a degree, nationalist and semi-authoritarian leaders. I think realistically more so Netanyahu with his attacks on the judiciary than Modi, whose authoritarianism is, I think, less ambitious. But he is seen as in that mold, more or less. So there's political, geopolitical, economic, and security alignment of every kind. It's a rare moment for Netanyahu in his current geopolitical environment where he can bask in a lot of positivity.
Right, and to say, we are not regionally isolated, which is obviously the term that you mentioned.
Not at all.
Again, India is the biggest democracy in the world. This is no small nation that he is meeting with right now. From Israel's point of view, obviously we heard this rhetoric from Netanyahu about the axis of moderate states strategy. And there's also talk of IMEC, right? The India, Middle East, Europe corridor that would essentially allow Israel to be that bridge between Europe and India. The question is, what will it take to actually get to that point, given the fact that those involved, like Saudi Arabia, for example, are not necessarily convinced that they are willing to become a partner of peace with the state of Israel?
The Saudis are not quite on board, and I'm not sure that the European Union at this point wants to give Netanyahu that kind of victory. In the future, of course, there's potential. Anyone looking at the map of the world can't fail to see that Israel sits at the crossroads. There's a reason why this particular small piece of land has, throughout history for millennia, been such a valuable trade route, which eventually became a very valuable cultural point and flashpoint. Israel is very well placed for this, but I think it has to await a future Israel that's not at loggerheads with so much of the world. The Western world, that's Israel's main trading partner, but also, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia is not quite there, and that's a pretty big piece of that puzzle.
Ratnadeep, I want to turn back to you for some more Indian perspective here. Obviously, these defense deals, $8.6 billion, that's a very, very big deal for the state of Israel. How do you see them impacting India's own military capabilities and just its regional posture? How concerned is India about what is happening in Pakistan and Bangladesh?
India has a great relationship when it comes to this defense pact. In fact, one of the things that India had a relation with Israel even before they recognized the official state of Israel was the defense partnership. So India does values this. And it comes at a point of time where we have active conflict with Pakistan, and there are regional tensions flaring. So India does look at this because even though the fact that India wants to indigenize, and that's what something even Israel is trying to do, diversify its defense capabilities, but India realizes the pace at which it has to indigenize, it cannot, because we have an active war front. We had the war with Pakistan, and we have seen the amount of defense capacities that India require, which Israel comes to the picture and helps us because Israel has one of the partner who hasn't asked questions and have always provided the equipments wherever we needed it. Mm-hmm. So India looks at this as a very special relationship, especially the strategic partnership that India and Israel share.
Right. Beyond defense, we know that India and Israel are talking about, trade, cyber, AI, health tech, med tech. How significant is that type of collaboration for India at this point?
One of the reasons why India trusts Israel so much is because of the agri-tech products, for example. India had a shortage of water. India didn't know how to utilize water properly. The drip irrigation technique of Israel came into use, and it had increased the productivity of our agriculture multifolds. The agricultural excellence centers that India and Israel have jointly cooperated with has been doing excellent. And this comes with other, for example, the Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Netanyahu is supposed to go to this innovation summit as well, innovation exhibition, where they're going to look at the other innovation technologies that Israel has. Right. And Prime Minister is eyeing on some of these innovation technologies to bring back home because what Israel has is the technology, but what India offers is scalability. So it's actually a match made in heaven in that way.
Yeah. No, Dan, I saw that you were nodding, obviously, in response to what he was saying. I guess, the final question before we move to our next topic is the biggest takeaways so far from what we've seen of this visit.
Oh, it clearly has to do with Israel's potential as a tech hyperscaler, if the context is right. But also, it does reflect that there is some hope for Israel to recover from the geopolitical legitimacy hit that it absorbed during this war. India is very useful for projecting that, I think, to the rest of the world. The world can't ignore India. And if India is so clearly on the side of Israel, that's not insignificant. I'd also add that Israel, one of its messaging points to the world is the not unjustifiable claim that it is at the forefront of the assault by radical Islam upon Western civilization and in general civilization. And countries in Europe tend to be skeptical about this sometimes, and unwisely so. India isn't, and that's because whereas Israel may be on the forefront of it, India is not so far behind. Maybe some in India might think it's even more at the forefront because of their longstanding tensions with Pakistan, but all the terrorism that happens around that. For Israel, I'd also add, Israel wants good relations with the Muslim world. India is not a Muslim country. Some would see it as the opposite of, and yet India, I do believe, has the world's third largest Muslim population. So it's not inconsequential if Israel can have such good relations with India and the Muslims in India don't rebel.
I'm interested to hear from you, Ratnadeep, a final question. I know that you are expert in terrorism, counterterrorism. How concerned is India about non-state actors posing a threat to Indian security? Obviously, we know that there is largely belief that there are foreign actors that are getting involved in Pakistan, strengthening terrorist organizations on the ground.
Well, we are very concerned, especially in the Kashmir theater, because it's a volatile region, and we have had history of terrorism in that region. And it's to say it that it's just restricted to Kashmir would be an understatement, because what we have seen in the last year was the blast in Delhi, for example, or I was on your show when we spoke about the nexus of doctors who were trying to work with the ISKP to use raisin poison against Indians. So we have had a history of terrorism, and that's why one of the things that Prime Minister Modi said, that he understands what Israel goes through when there is an act of terrorism, because we have gone through the same and we go through it every day.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us. Ratnadeep, we're going to be saying goodbye to you now, but really fascinating to hear the Israeli perspective. Dan, you're sticking with us. Big news out of Somaliland. Israel is taking a historic step in the Horn of Africa, formally accepting the appointment of Somaliland's first ambassador to Tel Aviv, Mohammed Hagi. Hagi, who is an advisor to Somaliland's president and a longtime advocate for stronger ties with Israel, is now officially representing the self-declared nation, which has sought independence from Somalia since 1991. Now, Israel says it is also going to soon appoint its own ambassador to Somaliland, which would essentially cement this brand new diplomatic relationship. But the move comes as Somaliland President Abdirahman Mohamed Abdullahi is expected to visit Jerusalem at the end of March for his first official trip to Israel. Here's what Ambassador Hagi has to say.
Somaliland is an independent country in the Horn of Africa, a very democratic country that always, and its people are very peace-loving people. We heard that there are lots of condemnation coming from the mentioned countries, for example, China and Turkey as well. But Somaliland's relations with Israel is a peaceful one, is a one that is securing the peace and strengthening peace in the Horn of Africa region as well as in the Middle East.
I'd like to turn now to our international affairs analyst, Dan Perry. Dan, what does this appointment mean for Somaliland? Now that the relationship is fully moving forward, could Somaliland now face more serious threats from the region?
Oh, clearly. They're gambling that this will net positive for them. But obviously, they've created some unhappiness, especially with their large neighbor to the south, Somalia, and also with their neighbor across the Gulf of Aden, Yemen. Israel has a lot to offer Somaliland for sure. And this is a very good sign for Israel's foreign relations. And in particular, this will enable Israel a base across from the Houthis. Should they ever choose to provoke Israel again in the future, they may find themselves facing Israeli retaliation coming from 100 miles away and not 1,000 miles away.
Interestingly, in the State of the Union address by Trump, we saw quite a heated interaction, you could say, with Ilhan Omar. She is, of course, Somalian. We have seen Trump say very, very negative things about the country of Somalia. And there have been these reports that, Somaliland is offering access to minerals, to a military base to the United States. Do you think that something is going to come of that?
Yeah, it easily could. If Somaliland aligns itself with Israel, it's not so far away that they should be aligning with America. And I don't think they're above the transactionalism that Trump favors. It looks like they're going to be a Western ally for a while. And that may put them at further loggerheads with Somalia, that if anything thinks Somaliland belongs to it. But the reality is that these two countries, despite the similar name, have a very different colonial past. They were distinct in the past. Mm-hmm. And however absurd that may seem, the colonial map of 100 years ago, 70 years ago, is what determined the map of Africa today.
Let's just break down the biggest takeaways from the State of the Union address. What message, or what do you think the biggest message is that Trump is trying to send to the world?
Boy, being the Trump explainer has to be one of the world's most thankless jobs. His message was contradictory because on the one hand, he set Iran an absurdly low bar for buying more time. He said all they got to do is say the magic words, we don't want a nuclear weapon. Well, they've kind of been saying that. It's a lie because they've been enriching to weapons grade levels, so we have no reason to believe it. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, if they say those words, it'll be difficult for Trump to attack the next minute, so they can buy time that way. On the other hand, he embraced and validated the upper end of the estimates of the death toll and the suppression of the riots or the protests in Iran, saying 32,000 were killed. That is one of two things that can justify a military action aimed at regime change. I mean, generally speaking, even if a country has a dictatorial government, you don't attack it because we'd have nothing but wars in the world. And you somehow depend on a population to overthrow its dictators. How to do that is another question. But there are two circumstances that justify an attack on a country to achieve regime change. One of them is if the brutal barbarism is just too much to tolerate. And mm-hmm. I think 32,000 people killed in a protest to gain freedom qualifies. And the other is if they're aggressive and dangerous to their region, and Iran has done that via the proxies. Right. So it really could go either way. It could go towards some kind of appeasement deal very soon if Iran says the right words, which they would be incredibly reckless and stupid not to. Or we could be headed towards a war mm-hmm. where dynamic to finish the job and actually topple the regime, assuming that the protests will resume in full force if there is such an attack, will be strong.
You know, I think obviously the real question is whether or not Trump's foreign policy messaging is going to be shaped the most by politics at home or by this, strategy abroad. But we're going to have to discuss that at a later point. Dan Perry, thank you for joining us.